Welcome to another exciting episode of Philosophical Foundations. Today we're exploring one of the most fundamental debates in the history of philosophy, the contrasting worldviews of Plato and Aristotle.
It's wonderful to be here, discussing these timeless ideas that continue to shape our understanding of reality and knowledge.
Let's start with the historical context. These philosophers weren't working in a vacuum, were they?
Not at all. 5th and 4th century BCE, Athens was experiencing what we might call an intellectual revolution. The city was at its height of power and cultural influence, and there was this remarkable shift happening in how people thought about the world. The old mythological explanations were being questioned, and thinkers were developing new ways to understand reality through reason and observation.
And Socrates played a crucial role in this transformation, didn't he?
Absolutely. Socrates was really the catalyst for this new way of thinking. He would walk through the streets of Athens, engaging people in conversations that would often expose the limitations of their understanding. But what made his method so powerful wasn't just that he asked questions, it was how he asked them.
Could you give our listeners an example of the Socratic method in action?
Let's say someone claimed to know what justice is. Socrates might ask them to define it. They might say, justice is treating everyone equally. He would then ask if it's just to treat a child the same as an adult or a criminal the same as an innocent person. Through this process of questioning, he would reveal that their initial understanding was incomplete or contradictory.
That's fascinating, and this method influenced Plato's approach to philosophy.
Profoundly. Plato witnessed his teacher's execution by the Athenian democracy, which deeply affected his view of justice and truth. He came to believe that true knowledge couldn't come from popular opinion or sensory experience alone. This led him to develop his theory of forms, which is really one of the most ambitious attempts to explain the nature of reality in philosophical history.
Could you break down this theory of forms for our listeners? I know it can seem quite abstract at first.
Let's approach it step by step. First, consider any beautiful object, say, a painting or a sunset. Plato would ask, what makes it beautiful? We might point to certain qualities like harmony, proportion, or color. But then he'd push further. What makes these qualities beautiful? Why do we recognize beauty across such different things?
Right, because we can see beauty in such diverse things: music, nature, art.
Exactly. This led Plato to propose that there must be something beyond all these particular instances of beauty, a perfect, unchanging form of beauty itself. And this isn't just true for beauty, but for all concepts: justice, goodness, truth. Even mathematical concepts like circles and triangles.
So in Plato's view, everything we see around us is kind of imperfect.
Yes, and this is crucial to understanding Plato's worldview. He believed that the physical world is constantly changing and therefore unreliable as a source of true knowledge. The forms, on the other hand, are perfect, eternal, and unchanging. They exist in what he called the realm of forms, which can only be accessed through reason and philosophical contemplation.
That's quite mind-bending, but I understand Aristotle had some serious problems with this theory.
Indeed. Aristotle spent 20 years studying at Plato's academy, but ultimately developed a very different understanding of reality. He famously said, "Plato is dear to me, but dearer still is truth." He believed we didn't need to posit a separate realm of forms to explain reality.
So what was Aristotle's alternative explanation?
Aristotle developed what we might call a more naturalistic approach. He believed that the essence of things, what Plato would call their form, exists within the objects themselves. He developed a sophisticated framework for understanding reality based on careful observation and logical analysis.
Could you give us an example of how Aristotle's approach differs from Plato's?
Let's take a tree. Plato would say there's a perfect form of tree-ness. in the realm of forms, and all actual trees are imperfect copies of this ideal. Aristotle would say, look at the tree itself. He'd examine its structure, its growth patterns, its relationship to other living things. He'd say the essence of tree-ness is found in the natural world through observation and analysis.
This seems to relate to their different approaches to knowledge. How did they think we come to know things?
This is where their differences become really crucial for understanding modern debates about knowledge. Plato believed in what we call rationalism, the idea that true knowledge comes through reason and intellectual intuition. He even argued that all learning is really recollection of knowledge our souls possessed before birth.
That's quite a claim. How does he justify that?
He demonstrates this in his dialogue, Meno, where Socrates helps an uneducated slave boy discover geometric truths through careful questioning. Plato argued that the boy couldn't have learned these truths from experience. They must have been Latin in his soul.
And I assume Aristotle took a different view.
Completely different. Aristotle believed knowledge begins with sensory experience. He developed what we now call empiricism, the idea that knowledge comes from observation and experience. But he wasn't a pure empiricist. He believed we use reason to understand the patterns and principles we observe in nature.
It's amazing how these ancient debates parallel modern discussions about science and knowledge. Could you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. Consider modern physics. When physicists develop mathematical models to describe reality that can't be directly observed, string theory. For instance, they're working in a somewhat Platonic tradition, using pure reason to grasp fundamental truths. But when they conduct experiments and gather empirical data, they're following Aristotle's approach.
That's fascinating. And what about in other fields?
These approaches influence everything from education to ethics. Take modern education debates. Should we focus on teaching practical skills, Aristotelian approach, or develop students' ability to reason abstractly, a Platonic approach? In ethics, do we derive moral principles from observing human nature and society as at Aristotle, or from contemplating perfect ideals of justice and goodness, as Plato?
Speaking of ethics, how did their different views of reality affect their moral philosophy?
This is crucial. Plato believed that just as there's a form of beauty or truth, there is a form of the good, the ultimate source of all value and meaning. He thought that only by understanding this perfect form could we know how to live rightly and create a just society.
Which led to his famous concept, the philosopher, king in the republic, right?
Exactly. Plato argued that only those who had ascended to knowledge of the forms, particularly the form of the good, were qualified to rule. Aristotle, by contrast, believed that ethical knowledge comes from studying actual human behavior in societies, looking for patterns and principles that lead to human flourishing.
This is also relevant to contemporary debates. How do you see these different approaches playing out in modern times?
We see this tension everywhere. In politics, between idealists who envision perfect systems and pragmatists who focus on what works in practice. In science, between theoretical physicists searching for elegant mathematical theories and experimental scientists gathering empirical data. In art, between those who seek to capture ideal beauty and those who document reality as they find it.
Seems like both approaches have their value. Do we have to choose between Plato and Aristotle?
That's a profound question. Sarah, I'd argue that the greatest achievements in human thought often come from combining both approaches. We need Plato's ability to think beyond the immediate and visible, to imagine perfect ideals that can guide us. But we also need Aristotle's careful attention to the actual world and his systematic approach to understanding it.
A fascinating discussion. Before we wrap up, what would you say to our listeners who want to explore these ideas further?
I'd encourage them to read these philosophers firsthand. Start with Plato's Republic and Symposium and Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and Metaphysics. But more importantly, practice both approaches in your own thinking. Ask both, what would the perfect version of this be? And what does the evidence actually show?
Thank you so much. This has been incredibly enlightening. Listeners, don't forget to visit our website for recommended readings.
Thank you. As Aristotle said, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. Keep questioning, keep thinking, and keep seeking understanding.
And that's all for this extended episode of Philosophical Foundations. If you enjoyed this discussion, please share it with friends and leave us a comment. Until next time, keep philosophizing